NFL Dynasties. Which teams have them? Which teams came close? And which teams came close but felt nothing but devastation? And what even constitutes an NFL Dynasty? This is your complete and totally official guide to NFL Dynasties. Let's get into it.
Sports are history.
Part 1. The Dynasties. Who are the dynasties we can all agree upon? Well, we've had basically one every decade since the 70s. And no, we don't care about those pre-Super Bowl NFL championships when there were like 12 teams in the league. We all know all the important things to happen in the NFL happened from 1966 and onward. As far as the dynasties we care about anyways. Call them Super Bowl dynasties if you must. And let's get on with it. We'll start in the 70s. I know some of you would like us to go to the 60s, and we will, I promise. But let's start with those 70s Steelers, where we had maybe the greatest NFL dynasty. They won 4 Super Bowls in 6 years, twice going back to back. First in 74 and 75, and then again in 78 and 79. They overcame fourth quarter deficits to win their second and fourth Super Bowls, and in their third Super Bowl win, we had an all-time classic against the Cowboys in the first Super Bowl that saw each team put up over 30 points. The Steelers dynasty had more Hall of Famers than your mother has late-night callers. I'm talking Mean Joe Green, linebackers Jack Ham and Jack Lambert, cornerback Mel Blount, and safety Donnie Shell, all on that legendary steel curtain defense, and that was just the defense. On the offensive side, they had just as many Hall of Famers in quarterback Terry Blonde Bomber Bradshaw, wide receivers Lynn Swann and John Stallworth, center Mike Webster, and everyone's favorite immaculate receptioner, running back Frank O. Harris. Add in Hall of Fame and legendary head coach Chuck Noll to tie the whole thing together. And it's not hard to see why many consider this the greatest dynasty in NFL history. Calm down, Patriots fans, we'll get to you. To make one thing clear, I am going to say the year the regular season was played in and not the year that they won the Super Bowl. As you've seen, I will display the Super Bowl number. It can be a confusing thing in football, but for instance, you've probably heard of the 1985 Bears, probably the best defense ever. Well, 1985 was the year they played in the regular season, while the Super Bowl that they won was in January of '86. But we always refer to them as the 1985 Bears. I'm going to do the same thing for all these teams here. Cool? Cool. This is why they number Super Bowls. Next, we'll go to the 1980s, where we have the 49ers, who won 4 Super Bowls in 9 years, with new and inventive West Coast offense being implemented by Hall of Fame head coach Bill Walsh, although George Seifert was their head coach for the 4th one. They had maybe the greatest Super Bowl quarterback of all time. Calm down, Patriots fans. Joe Montana. Joe Montana was a perfect 4-0 in his 4 Super Bowl appearances, throwing 11 touchdowns to no interceptions, completing 68% of his passes, and an average quarterback rating of 127.8. I mean, his lowest quarterback rating in any of those Super Bowls was 100. It's tough to get better. They would win the Super Bowl in 81 and 84, and then back-to-back in 88 and 89. They had the most lopsided Super Bowl victory, beating those Broncos in that 4th Super Bowl of theirs, 55-10. The one Super Bowl they didn't win handedly was their 3rd one in 88, but it's also the one where Joe Montana would lead a 92-yard, 11-play game-winning drive, throwing that game-winning touchdown pass with all but 34 seconds left on the clock and giving his team a 4-point lead that they would not relinquish.
I said, hey, man, there's John Candy.
Then we'll go to the Cowboys of the 90s, who won 3 Super Bowls in 4 years, going back-to-back in 92 and 93, and then adding another one in 95. Put together by Hall of Fame head coach Jimmy Johnson, who was only there for the first 2 Super Bowls before their egomaniac of an owner, Jerry Jones, couldn't stand another man getting credit for his glory hole and ran Johnson out of the building. Jerry Jones would bring in Barry Switzer as their next head coach and human duct tape, and just like duct tape holding together an engine block, he was good enough for one last ride. helping them win the Super Bowl in '95.
It is a reminder I've been here when it was glory hole days, and I've been here when it wasn't.
Jimmy Johnson famously built this team off of the Herschel Walker trade in 1989 by trading running back Herschel Walker to the Vikings in exchange for their first 2 draft picks. For the next 3 years, including their 3rd round draft pick in the 3rd year. Meaning that in 1990, the Cowboys would control the Vikings' first 2 draft picks, and in 91, they would control the Vikings' first 2 draft picks, and in 92, they would control the Vikings' first 3 draft picks. And by that 92 season, when they controlled the Vikings' first 3 draft picks the Vikings had traded for Herschel Walker, well, the Vikings no longer had Herschel Walker. He did essentially nothing for them, while the Cowboys used the trade compensation they got for him to build their dynasty. The biggest piece the Cowboys would get with that trade compensation was Emmitt Smith, who along with Troy Aikman and human cocaine vacuum Michael Irvin complete their 3-headed monster and lead them to 3 Super Bowl champions.
I want me some glory hole.
Now, let's go to this century, where in the first decade of it, we had the Patriots winning 3 Super Bowls in 4 years, first in 2001 and then going back-to-back in 2003 and 4, led by head coach and all-time Jets tease Bill Belichick, who would turn their defense into a force to be reckoned with, holding the MVP of the league, Kurt Warner, and the greatest show on turf Rams to only 17 points in their first Super Bowl victory in 2001. They, of course, also had all-time clutch and current GOAT Tom Brady, and we would certainly be remiss if we did not mention all-time clutch kicker Adam Vinatieri. See, they won all 3 of these Super Bowls by 3 points, and in those first 2 Super Bowls, they did it with Tom Brady driving them down the field in the final minutes of the game, and Adam Vinatieri making the field goal in the final seconds of the game to win it. The Belichick and Brady Patriots would also make it to the Super Bowl in 2007 and 2011, but lose to the Eli Manning-led Giants each time. 2007 was, of course, their undefeated regular season, the only time a team has gone undefeated in a 16 or more game regular season. A painful fact for the 2007 Patriots, and who doesn't want a little pain for this era of the Patriots, is that they had the same exact win streak as the 72 Dolphins. The 72 Dolphins are the only team to ever go undefeated, but they did it at a time when the regular season was only 14 games, and including the Super Bowl, the most you could play in a season was 17. The Dolphins had just come off losing the Super Bowl the previous season, so they started their win streak in week 1 of the 72 season and would not lose until week 2 of the 73 season. So altogether, they had an 18-game win streak. The same as the 2007 Patriots, but with a 16-game regular season, 18 games was only good enough to get you to the Super Bowl. You needed 19 to win it and go completely undefeated. Nowadays, you need 20. We'll move on to the 2010s, where you have the Patriots starting their second dynasty, or part 2 if you'd rather. It was 10 years after completing their first dynasty, still being led by quarterback Tom Brady and coach Bill Belichick. This time they would win 3 in 5 years, go to a 4th Super Bowl in those 5 years, including a stretch where they went to 3 consecutive Super Bowls. They would start in 2014 by beating the why the f*** you handed to Marshawn Lynch Seahawks, and then 2 years later in 2016 beating the Falcons in the greatest comeback in Super Bowl history, along with the first Super Bowl to go to overtime.
I feel pain right now. That's unbelievable.
They go back to the Super Bowl the next year, but lose it this time to the Eagles, 41-33, in one of the greatest Super Bowls ever, an all-time classic that saw the most total points and total offensive yards ever in a Super Bowl. The next year, they would go back and beat the Rams again, 13-3, in perhaps the most boring Super Bowl of all time. So you would go from having 2 of the greatest and most exciting Super Bowls ever to one of the most boring Super Bowls of all time, but perhaps it was a suiting book ending for this Patriots dynasty. See, the 2018 Rams team would have an even more prolific offense than the 2001 team that they beat. to start their first dynasty. The Patriots held the 2018 Rams to only 3 points in that Super Bowl. The Patriots themselves only scored 13 points in the Super Bowl. It was the fewest amount of points they scored in any of their Super Bowl wins, and yet this was their largest margin of victory in any of those Super Bowl wins. And the only one where they scored, or where they won by multiple scores. It was also the fewest amount of points ever scored by a winning team in a Super Bowl, and the fewest amount of total points period in a Super Bowl at 16. So in back-to-back years, you would have the Super Bowl with the most total points, and then the Super Bowl with the least amount of points. Brought to you by that Patriots dynasty. Maybe the greatest dynasty. We don't want to overlook the elephant in the room. We won't get into it, but both parts of the dynasty were marred with scandals. You have Spygate in their first dynasty, and Deflategate for their second dynasty. This does dampen the greatness of the dynasties some. I don't think we'll ever see back-to-back dynasties by any team, no matter how much they cheat. But perhaps it does make the Steelers one better. Now let's move on to my personal favorite dynasty, the Chiefs of the 2020s. They would win 3 Super Bowls in 5 years so far. First in 2019, I know it's not technically 2020s, but the Super Bowl was played in February of 2020, so close enough. And then a few years later, going back-to-backs, winning it in 2022 and 23. They would overcome 10-point deficits in all 3 Super Bowl wins. First, in Super Bowl 54 against the 49ers, they would find themselves down 10 points with just under 9 minutes left to go in the fourth quarter. They seemed cooked. I mean, Mahomes had just come off back-to-back drives where he threw an interception, and it had been quite a bad day for him. But then they proceeded to score 21 unanswered points, this time Mahomes throwing 2 touchdowns and Damian Williams running in the last one to win the game 31-20. A few years later, they would find themselves down 10 at half to the Eagles when Mahomes, on a sprained ankle, and I'm sure a whole bunch of
needles, Vicodin, Toradol, Lidocaine,
along with an offensive line that didn't give up a sack the entire game, led the offense to points on every drive of that second half. The very next year, they would go back to the Super Bowl and face the 49ers again. In the second Super Bowl ever to go to overtime, they would have the first walk-off touchdown pass in Super Bowl history, Mahomes to Mecole Hardman. They would, of course, also lose 2 Super Bowls in this time, first to the Bucs in 2020, and then again to the Eagles in 2024, each in blowout fashion, I'm sure you remember. But that would make it 5 Super Bowls in 6 years so far, including a run of 3 straight Super Bowls from 2022 to 24. And there are your solidified, no doubt about it, NFL dynasties. But before we move on, we must talk about the Packers of the 60s. Some people don't consider them a dynasty because they only won 2 Super Bowls, but it was the first 2 Super Bowls, and had the Super Bowl existed even 1 year prior, they almost assuredly would have won it. They won the NFL championship in 1965, the year before the Super Bowl existed. They also won the NFL championship in back-to-back years in 61 and 62. So, had the Super Bowl been around even 1 more year, even a few more years, they would have gotten their 3rd Super Bowl. Almost definitely. The Super Bowl trophy is even named after their coach, Vince Lombardi. So, a lot of people, including the official NFL dynasty list, grandfathers them in and considers them the first dynasty, the 60s dynasty. And they will be considered such going forward. And for all of you
These are technically Super Bowl dynasty
types, if you really must, we can quickly recap the pre-Super Bowl NFL dynasties, the dynasties of yore. In the 1950s, we would have had both the Lions and the Browns having a dynasty, proving that the NFL gods have an insatiable kink for painful irony. In the 1940s, the Bears would have had a dynasty. In the 1930s, the Packers again. And in the 1920s, the Bulldogs would have had a dynasty. Who are the Bulldogs? They are exactly why we don't talk about pre-Super Bowl NFL dynasties. there were also like 8 to 12 teams during that time, so it's kind of hard not to have a dynasty. So to recap the actual, totally official NFL dynasties, you've got the Packers of the 60s, the Steelers of the 70s, the 49ers of the 80s, the Cowboys of the 90s, the Patriots of the 2000s, the Patriots of the 2010s, and the Chiefs of the 2020s. Part 2. What constitutes an NFL dynasty? Now that we've gone over all the dynasties, what commonalities can we take from them to form a criteria for what would constitute a team winning a dynasty? Well, the first thing they all had in common was that they won 3 championships. I think this is kind of the obvious one. It goes for most American sports, I believe. You need 3 to call yourself a dynasty. I remember the Patriots of the 2000s holding up that dynasty newspaper after getting their 3rd one. I remember my Chiefs not wanting to call it a dynasty after the 2nd one, but then calling it a dynasty after the 3rd one.
So is it a dynasty now? Yeah.
So I think 3 it is. That's reasonable, right? Okay, what is the second thing? Well, what about the time frame that they need to win these championships in? Every dynasty has won at least 3 championships in a 6-year period. The 49ers were actually the only ones that needed 6 years to get 3 in, doing it from 84 to 89. All the other dynasties had 3 and 5, but I think, at least getting 3 and 6 is a good criteria, right? It means that you can point to a stretch of years in the NFL of 6 or more where a team won at least half the championships in that period. So, if a team were to win 3 and 7, but then win the very next year, making it 4 and 8, almost certainly a dynasty, right? So if there is a stretch of 6 or more years where a team has won half the championships, you've got really all you need to call yourself a dynasty. But that is not all these teams had in common, so there are some other factors to consider. The third thing they had in common was that they all had the same Hall of Fame quarterback and at least one other Hall of Fame player for every championship of the dynasty. Unless you count the Patriots, 2 dynasties as one, in which case they only had the same QB, who will certainly be in the Hall of Fame as soon as he's eligible. But they also had the same head coach for all of them, which I guess brings us to the head coach. All of these dynasties had the same head coach, except for 2 of them, the Niners and the Cowboys. But in each case, we give all of the credit to that first head coach. So I think where the official rules are going to land on this, we'll consult them, but I'm pretty sure where they're going to land on this is that you're going to need at least 2 Hall of Fame players and or head coach throughout all of the championships for that dynasty. They are the identity of that dynasty. They're often the thing we most associate the dynasty with. Now, some of you might be wondering,
Who is that other Hall of Famer that was there for all the 49ers championships? For all 4 of them, not just those 3.
in its safety, Ronnie Lott. The fourth thing they all had in common was they all won back-to-back Super Bowls, except for the Patriots' second dynasty, but they did go to 3 straight Super Bowls and they won 2 of those. So the official rule here is you need to make at least consecutive Super Bowls, and within that consecutive Super Bowl stretch, you need to win at least 2 of those. Now, maybe you hate this rule and we throw it out altogether, because what if a team were to win, 3 and 6 years, but not have back-to-back Super Bowl appearances? We'd probably still call it a dynasty, and we'll cross that bridge when we come to it, but for now, the rule stands. We also seem to really like it that they all won their Super Bowls in these dynasties within the same decade. We love saying the 70s Steelers, the 90s Cowboys, but that would be a silly qualification, so we're not going to add it. I mean, the official rules are not going to have it. To sum up the actual qualifications, you need at least 3 Super Bowls. You need to win half the Super Bowls in a 6 or more year stretch of years, and you need to have at least 2 Hall of Fame players and or head coach on all of those championships for your dynasty. And the fourth thing is that you need to make it to consecutive Super Bowls and win at least 2 of those Super Bowls in that consecutive Super Bowl appearance stretch. Official rules. And look, I know some people are going to be like, well,
What if you win 3 in 7 years? Wouldn't we call that a dynasty?
I don't know. We'll cross that bridge if it ever comes. And then
Well, the 49ers, they won 4 in 9 years. Do you count that fourth one? That first one in 81?
yes, let's just call it, right? Let's add it in there. Stop being such sticklers. Official rules. And if you want another fun thing they all had in common that is certainly not going to be a part of the rules, but, you know, a little fun fact for you. Besides the 60s Packers, they all beat a team twice in a Super Bowl en route to their dynasty. The Steelers beat the Cowboys twice. The 49ers beat the Bengals twice. The Cowboys did it to the Bills. The Patriots, if you count both their dynasties as one, beat the Rams twice, and the Chiefs beat the 49ers twice. Just a fun fact. Part 3, the teams that got close. So we've gone over the 6 dynasties, or 7 if you count the Patriots as 2, but did you know there were just as many teams that got close that could either never win that third one or couldn't do it within 6 years? Now, some people will want to say that some of these teams we're about to go over are dynasties, but they'd be wrong. We'll have to go back again to the 70s, where we should have had our first dynasty in the Miami Dolphins. Under legendary head coach Don Shula, Hall of Fame fullback Larry Zonka, some even say Bob Greasy was there. They made it to 3 straight Super Bowls from 71 to 73. They would lose the first one in 71, but then win back-to-back in 72 and 73, and of course, as we've mentioned already, have an undefeated team in those 72 Dolphins. Had they won the first Super Bowl, not only would they be a dynasty, we might consider them the greatest dynasty. They would be the only ones with, 3 straight Super Bowl wins and have an undefeated season. You got so close, Dolphins, but you need 3. Staying in the 70s, we go to the Cowboys, who went to 5 Super Bowls in 9 years, but could only win 2 of them. Led by Hall of Fame head coach Tom Landry and Hall of Fame quarterback Roger Staubach, they would go to back-to-back Super Bowls in 70 and 71. They would lose the first one and then win that second one against those Dolphins we just talked about. They would go back to the Super Bowl in 75 and lose it, and then go back-to-back again in 77 and 78, this time winning the first one and losing the second one. Next, we go to a team that was able to win back-to-back Super Bowl appearances, but never made it to that third one. The Broncos of the 90s. They won back-to-back in 97 and 98 with Hall of Fame head coach Mike Shanahan and Hall of Fame running back Terrell Davis. Who knows what would have happened if Elway wouldn't have retired. Now, his body was pretty old and falling apart at this time, but he did win the MVP for that second Super Bowl, so who knows? Then we have the Steelers of the 2000s. They went to 3 Super Bowls in 6 years, winning it in 2005 and again in 2008. They then made it to a third one in 2010, but they lost it, this time to the Packers. This is where we might throw out that consecutive Super Bowl appearances rule, right? Because I think had they won that third one, we would have called it a dynasty. They were talking about it before that Super Bowl, like,
Is this a dynasty if they win?
but they didn't, so we don't got to worry about it. Now we go to the 2 teams with the more intriguing case, I think, for a dynasty, seeing as they did win 3 Super Bowls, but they just couldn't do it within that 6-year period. We'll start with the first one that may have the least or weaker case for being a dynasty, the Washington Redskins of the 1980s/90s. Washington would go to 4 Super Bowls in 10 years, winning 3 of them. First in 82 under quarterback Joe Theismann. They would go back to the Super Bowl the very next year in 84, but lose it this time. They would then go in 87 and win it with quarterback Doug Williams, and then go back again in 91 and win it with quarterback Mark Rippon. So in 10 years, they made 4 Super Bowls and won 3 of them. Doing so all under legendary and maybe the most underrated head coach ever, Joe Gibbs. Gibbs won 3 Super Bowls with 3 different quarterbacks, the only coach to do so. Joe Gibbs won the Super Bowl, that 91 Super Bowl and that 82 Super Bowl with essentially 2 different teams. They didn't have a single shared player, and no coach has ever won a Super Bowl with essentially 2 different teams. You've had plenty of head coaches who have made it to a Super Bowl with two different teams. There's like half a dozen, but none of them could win it with two different teams. And in this way, Joe Gibbs is the closest to do so. So all I'm saying is when you hear a list of the greatest head coaches of all time, we need to put Gibbs in there. You're going to hear, Landry, Shulo, Walsh, Knoll, Belichick, all far more often than you hear Joe Gibbs. And Joe Gibbs really should be right there with them, seeing as he was able to do something none of them could do. But he didn't quite get a dynasty. Now we'll go to a team that maybe have the strongest case for being a dynasty, besides, I guess, maybe those Dolphins, out of all these teams we've mentioned. And it is the Raiders from 1976 to 83. They did win 3 Super Bowls, but it took them 8 years, right? They didn't have the same head coach or quarterback for all 3. They did have other players that were there for all 3 of them, including a trio of Hall of Famers and linebacker Ted Hendricks, punter Ray Guy, and wide receiver Cliff Branch. So they did have at least 2 Hall of Fame connecting pieces for all of them. It maybe didn't help that they were also in 2 different cities for it. Oakland for the first 2 and LA for the third one. Although that might make it more impressive. I don't know. Perhaps it would have helped their case if they would have had the same quarterback or head coach for all 3 of these, but they didn't. Maybe if they had done a back-to-back years, we would have, but they didn't. Or maybe they could have done it in a shorter amount of time, but they didn't. So, not on the official. This isn't just a Chiefs fan saying the Raiders don't have a dynasty. It's the official rules. Sorry, Raiders. Which brings us to our last part. Part 4, the devastating dynasties. We have teams that made it to a dynasty's worth of Super Bowls in a dynasty's amount of time, even making back-to-back appearances, all with the same Hall of Fame head coach and quarterback for the most part, but they couldn't win a single one. Now, you're probably thinking I'm talking about the Bills of the 90s, and I assure you that's one of them. We will get there, but we've got a couple others to go over. There's 3 of them total, and we'll go back, of course, to the 70s. Where we have the Vikings under Hall of Fame head coach Bud Grant and the most fearsome defensive line the league's ever seen, and those purple people eaters. This team would go to 4 Super Bowls in 8 years, including back-to-backs. First, they would go in 1969. The Super Bowl was played in 1970, so again, close enough. They would then make it back-to-back in 73 and 74, and then go again in 76. Not only would they lose all of these Super Bowls, they would do so in blowout fashion. I mean, 3 of them they lost by 16 or more, and this was before the 2-point conversion in the NFL, so that makes it 3-score losses. The Super Bowl they got the closest in was against the Steelers, where they lost by 10, and even in that Super Bowl, by the time the Vikings scored any points, the Steelers already had more points than the Vikings would get the entire game. In fact, this was the case for all of their Super Bowls. By the time the Vikings scored, the other team already had more points than the Vikings would get for the rest of the game. The Vikings were also shut out in the first half of all of these Super Bowls, not scoring until the 3rd quarter. But hey, they had Hall of Famers there for all 4 of these Super Bowls. Not Fran Tarkington, oddly enough, but they did have, of course, Alan Page and Carl Eller, center Mike Tingelhoff, but you didn't know that one, and safety Paul Krause. They are the most heartbreaking team of all time. Not just the 70 Vikings. No, I'm talking about the Vikings in totality. The Lions and Browns might be sadder. The Bills may even have a more peak heartbreak, right? But nobody has had quite the totality of heartbreak that the Minnesota Vikings have throughout their franchise's history. And it all started with that devastating dynasty in the 70s. Now we go to the 1980s. This one isn't as sad because this team has won Super Bowls since, but they would lose 3 Super Bowls in 4 years. We're talking about the Denver Broncos, who would first lose in 1986, and then the very next year in 87, and then 2 years later in 89. And just like the Vikings, not only did they lose all of these Super Bowls, they did so in blowout fashion. They lost every one of these Super Bowls by at least 19 points, including the biggest deficit ever in a Super Bowl, the one we mentioned with those 49ers, the Super Bowl 24 where they lost 55-10. The one qualifier that this team does not have is multiple Hall of Famers. Actually, the only Hall of Famer I believe on these teams was John Elway, which might make it all that much more impressive. Now, they did have the same head coach, Dan Reeves, for all three of these, and I think had they won even one of these Super Bowl, Dan Reeves would be in the Hall of Fame. You see, this isn't the only team Dan Reeves coached to a Super Bowl. No, in a cruel twist of fate, Dan Reeves would lead the Falcons to the Super Bowl in 1998 and get beat by the Denver Broncos. A fun side note with these Broncos of the 80s that on their way to creating their own devastating dynasty, they devastated another team even more. I mean, what's worse than losing 3 Super Bowls in 4 years? How about losing 3 AFC championships in 4 years and all to the same team? Yes, that's right. To make it to all 3 of these Super Bowls, the Broncos beat the same team every time in the AFC Championship. And what sad team was this? Well, the Cleveland Browns, of course. Yes, and these are the only 3 AFC championships the Cleveland Browns have ever been to. Finally, we have the devastating dynasty you've all been waiting for, the Bills of the 90s. They would go to 4 straight Super Bowls from 1990 to 93 and lose all of them. Known now as the 4 Falls of Buffalo after the great 30 for 30 documentary on the team, they were a powerhouse on offense. I mean, they had Hall of Famers in quarterback Jim Kelly, running back Thurman Thomas, wide receivers Andre Reed and James Lofton. You add in a Hall of Fame pass rusher Bruce Smith on the other side with Hall of Fame head coach Marv Levy. And this team should have been champions. I mean, at least once. It was peak heartbreak. The first loss was the most heartbreaking in terms of how it ended. They would be down 1 point with 8 seconds left to go when they would trot out their field goal kicker, Scott Norwood. Now, Scott Norwood had never made a 47-yard field goal on an outdoor grass field, which is what they were asking him to do here. In fact, in his entire career, he had only made 1 field goal from 40 or more yards out. So, the Bills asking their field goal kicker to do something he has never done before, of course, went out and he missed that kick. Now, if you ask the players, they will say when they saw that kick go up, at first, man, it looked like it was good until it got to about the 20-yard line and it started to float wide right. Now, Norwood would actually redeem himself a year later in the AFC Championship when he made the game-winning kick from 44 yards out to send the Bills to their 2nd Super Bowl.
Would have won it for Buffalo. This is a 44-yard try. Frank Reich to set it up. That would give what would seem almost an insurmountable 10-0 lead. It is good!
So I guess without Norwood, the Bills wouldn't have lost either of those first 2 Super Bowls. Anyways, Thurman Thomas would lose his helmet and the Bills would lose that 2nd Super Bowl along with it. The next year, they would actually have the greatest comeback ever in the NFL to that point anyways, in the wild card round of the playoffs. And they were down 35-3 to the Oilers and would come back to win it. It is still the 2nd largest comeback in all of NFL history and the largest one in NFL postseason history. It would help them reach their 3rd Super Bowl, where they would get trounced by the Cowboys, which apparently they loved so much that the very next year they would go to a 4th Super Bowl just to get trounced by the Cowboys again. But at least they had a lead at half in that one. And a fun fact, heartbreaking fact for this Bills team is that their record against the NFC in the regular season was 14-2. And yet in Super Bowls, it was 0-4. So there you have it. The devastating dynasties, each losing to an actual dynasty on the way to creating their own devastating one. 11 Super Bowls lost between all of them, and all but one of those lost in blown-out fashion because when it rains, it pours. And there it is. All you need to know about NFL dynasties. Now, if you think I missed anything, which I probably didn't, because again, official, well, let me know about it in the comments. If you liked it, maybe give me a like and a subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Okay, thanks, bye.